Exercise 20-27 Production Cost Report. So, Pure Water Company produces premium bottled water. In the second department, the bottling department, conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the bottling process, but packaging materials are not added until the end of the process. Costs in beginning work in process inventory include transferred in costs of $1,700, direct labor of $700, and manufacturing overhead of $330. March data for the bottling department follow. So we can click this open to see the data. I'll minimize that for now. So for requirement 1, prepare a production cost report for the bottling department for the month of March. The company uses the weighted average method. Complete all input fields, enter a 0 for any zero balances, round all costs per unit amounts to the nearest cent and all the amounts to the nearest whole dollar. Abbreviation used, EUP, is equivalent units of production. So what's going on here is when they're bottling their premium water, they take water from their raw materials inventory and it goes into the first process, which is probably the filtering department. And I don't think this problem explains what the name of this first department is. But then the water gets filtered here, and then once it's done filtering, it's going to transfer into the bottling department. And at the end of this process, it's going to be put into the direct materials, which is the bottle. And then the final part of the workflow process down here is once the premium water is bottled, it is therefore finished and it will be transferred out of this department and go into the finished goods inventory until it is sold. So as always for the production cost report, we're going to start with this unit section. So all we're going to be talking about here within this data is this first portion here, these units. So we do not need these costs yet. We can scoot these over. So let's start with our beginning inventory. So that's going to be that beginning work in process here, and that is this 12,000 units. So we can copy, paste, or type that in. So these 12,000 gallons here, these units here, were 40% complete. And because they were incomplete, that's why they started the month out in the work in process for the bottling department. And then we started production here of 163,000 units. So remember, since this is the second department, it doesn't actually start anything new. What it does is it takes units from the filtering department. So these 163,000 units, even though it says started, really it means transferred in. So you can call them started or transferred in. So we had then the 163,000 units here transferred in. So then our total units to account for are this beginning work in process of 12,000 and then this transferred in of 163,000. So we can go ahead and add those together, and that's going to give us a total units to account for of 175,000. So, and then we transferred out 152,000. So 152,000 units were bottled and then transferred out to the finished goods inventory, which means the rest of this 175,000, there's going to be 23,000 units left in the work in process for the bottling department. And that's given to us here also, but they are 70% complete. So unfinished, but 70% complete. So now let's go ahead and scroll down to units accounted for, which we were just talking about here. So that is going to be the completed and transferred out into the finished goods and the ending work in process, so the units that were not completed. So we are first focusing on these physical units. So again, the completed and transferred out comes here from the 152,000 units. So those are done, and then we still have 23,000 that are 70% complete. So these are incomplete that are going to stay in the work in process for now. And then we can add those up for the total units accounted for 175,000. And again, these total units to account for this 175,000 has to match the total units accounted for this 175,000. So now here we're going to calculate the equivalent units of production for each of these. So we're going to start with just this column that's transferred in, units. So these units are units that were transferred in the filtering department and were transferred into the bottling department. So we had to figure out what percentage of their costs are going to go from the filtering department to the bottling department. And since they are completed, it is 100% of those costs are going from the filtering department to the bottling department. The costs are not going to magically go away when we transfer from one department to another. In fact, they're going to accumulate. So the costs that were in the filtering department that got transferred in, these units are going to have 100% of the cost from the previous department. So that means for this 152,000, all 100% of it is going to be transferred in. So that's going to be 152,000 units. And then for ending work in process, that's going to be also 100% of 23,000. So all 23,000 is going to be transferred in. So then the total units accounted for is again going to be 175,000. So now let's talk about this 152,000 units that were completed and transferred out. Because they were transferred out, that means they're completed. So that means 100% of their costs are accounted for. So then for direct materials, we're going to have 152,000 and conversion costs 152,000 as well. So then now let's talk about this ending work in process. So this ending work in process inventory is 70% complete. But how many of those units have the direct materials added to them? So remember, the direct materials in this case, the packaging, which is the bottles, are not added until the end of the process here. So you'll see that packaging materials are not added until the end of the process. So this differs from our previous problems for that reason. So that means none of these units have direct materials added to them yet, because again, that they're only added at the end of the process. So that is going to be 0. Because they don't have any of the direct material costs attached to them in the bottling process. And then finally, for these 23,000 units, what percent has had conversion costs added to them? Well, remember up here it says conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the process. So that's right here, conversion costs incurred evenly throughout the bottling process. That means those conversion costs are 70% of the way through. So that means we're going to have to take this 23,000 units and multiply that by the 70%. So we have 23,000 times 0.70 to get that as percent there. And that is going to give us, if we round 16,100 in conversion cost for the ending work in process. So we can go ahead and round that up. And then we can finish our total units accounted for here. So we'll add for the direct materials 152,000 plus 0, so 152,000. Then we're going to add 152,000 here for the conversion cost to 16,100, and that is going to give us 168,100 in conversion costs for total units accounted for. So we'll check our answer here in a second, but the next video is going to deal with these costs here. So let's go ahead and reduce this and check our answer. Fantastic.